Vivienne Ashcroft only wanted a driver who could stay quiet, arrive on time, and never ask questions about where they were going or why. She got exactly that in Callum Reed, a soft-spoken man with tired eyes and a folder of paperwork that seemed strangely thin for someone his age. On his first day, she noticed a faded trident tattoo curling along his forearm and decided, without asking a single question, that it was the kind of thing men bought at a shop to feel important. She told him so, coolly, the way she dismissed most things that did not come with a spreadsheet attached. Callum did not argue. He simply pulled his sleeve down, adjusted the mirror, and pulled the car into traffic as if her words had never landed at all. 3 days later, on a quiet stretch of road leading toward a naval installation, black SUVs closed in around her car from every direction. Armed men stepped out in formation. Then an admiral stepped forward, stood at attention, and saluted the man behind the wheel. "Welcome back, Commander Reed. If you want to know why a real hero chose to disappear behind a steering wheel, stay with this story until the very end, because the truth changes everything you think you understand about him." Ashcroft Maritime Technologies had carried the family name for 3 generations, building its reputation on communication and rescue systems trusted by the United States military long before Vivienne ever set foot in the corner office she now occupied. She had inherited not only the company but the constant, exhausting suspicion that came with the name, the assumption from strangers and employees alike that her success had been handed to her rather than earned through years of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. It had made her careful in ways that sometimes curdled into coldness, quick to distrust anyone who seemed too eager to get close, especially men who wanted her to be impressed by stories she had no way to verify. Vivienne Ashcroft had fired her previous driver only a week earlier after discovering he had been selling her schedule to a gossip outlet for cash she considered laughably small given what it cost her in trust. With the Sentinel Beacon contract entering its final and most delicate phase, her security team insisted she could not go another day without someone behind the wheel she could rely on completely. Her assistant, Maris Bell, brought her a folder containing the name Callum Reed, a man with a flawless driving record and an employment history that thinned out considerably the further back it went. Vivienne barely glanced at the gaps. She had learned long ago that people who worked quietly rarely caused trouble, and trouble was the one thing she could not afford this month. During his interview, Callum made no effort to impress her, which she found almost insulting given how many men tried far too hard in that chair. He asked for 3 things only, spoken without a trace of apology in his voice. He did not want his photograph taken for any company badge or brochure. He did not want anyone searching through his personal belongings without asking first. And on days without an emergency, he needed to be finished by 8 in the evening. No exceptions. No negotiations. Vivienne thought the terms were strange for a driver, almost presumptuous, but she was out of better options and signed the paperwork anyway, telling herself she could always replace him if he proved difficult. Maris tried to fill in the silence by mentioning that Callum had a daughter, a small girl named Lena who lived with her grandmother across town while he worked long hours to build something steady for the 2 of them. Vivienne barely registered the detail at the time, filing it away the same way she filed away every other fact that did not immediately relate to quarterly numbers or contract deadlines. She asked him only one personal question during the entire interview, wanting to know why a man his age had so little professional history worth mentioning on paper. Callum told her, without elaboration, that some years were better measured by what a person protected than by what they listed on a resume, an answer that struck her as evasive rather than honest. She did not press further, partly because the next candidate was waiting outside, and partly because something in his tone suggested that pressing would accomplish nothing at all. On their very first drive together, She noticed how often his eyes moved to the mirrors instead of the road ahead, how he seemed to memorize license plates the way other people memorized song lyrics, how he always chose a parking space that faced the quickest way out of a lot. When he leaned under the hood to check something small, his sleeve rode up just enough to reveal the trident tattoo, its edges softened by years and sun. She could not help herself. She told him that symbols like that were easy to buy and easier to fake, and that she had met enough pretenders wearing borrowed valor to recognize the type on sight. Callum looked at her for a long moment, said nothing in his own defense, pulled the sleeve back down, and answered only that she was right, that a tattoo alone proved nothing about a man at all. The city rolled past the tinted windows in long amber streaks as evening settled over the financial district, the sound of the engine low and steady beneath the muffled hum of traffic. Callum drove with both hands relaxed on the wheel, his posture never shifting, his eyes moving in a rhythm Vivienne could not name, but somehow found herself watching more closely than she intended. She told herself it was simply professional caution, the same instinct that made her double-check every contract before signing it, nothing more than due diligence toward a man she barely knew. Still, there was something unsettling about how little he seemed to need from her. No small talk, no attempts to fill the silence, only the occasional glance in the mirror that told her he was paying attention to things she could not see. What Vivienne did not know, as she stepped out of the car that evening, without a second glance in his direction, was that Callum had already photographed a small tracking device hidden beneath the undercarriage of her vehicle, the kind that required training to notice and training to remove without alerting whoever had placed it there. He said nothing to her about it that night, choosing instead to study the device quietly in the privacy of the garage after she had gone inside, turning it over in his palm like a puzzle he had solved 100 times before in another life. Over the following 3 days, Callum altered their route without ever asking permission first, avoiding the main highway, skipping 2 familiar bridges, and stopping in places that made Vivienne visibly impatient in the back seat. She assumed he was performing some sort of theater, trying to appear mysterious and important in a job that required neither. When she finally demanded an explanation, he told her plainly that the same 3 vehicles had appeared near their route more times than coincidence should allow in a city of that size. She dismissed the observation outright, certain that a driver's paranoia was simply the price of hiring someone with an incomplete resume. Gideon Wexler had been at Vivienne's side for nearly 6 years, first as a trusted advisor to her late father, and later as the man she leaned on whenever the company's finances grew complicated enough to keep her awake at night. He came from old money himself, the kind that funded charity galas and university buildings, and he wore his loyalty to the Ashcroft name like a well-tailored suit, always visible, always convincing. Behind that carefully maintained image, Gideon had spent the better part of a year quietly negotiating with a rival firm eager to acquire Ashcroft Maritime the moment its stock price grew weak enough to make a hostile offer look reasonable to a nervous board. He told himself it was simply business, that someone was going to profit from the company's stumble eventually, and that it might as well be a man who understood its inner workings better than anyone else alive. At the office, Gideon Wexler pressed her hard to sign a data-sharing agreement with a new subcontractor, insisting the timeline could not survive another delay. Callum, waiting near the entrance as always, caught the words "Sentinel Beacon" drifting through the open door and felt something tighten in his chest, though his face gave away nothing. That evening, while driving Vivienne to a gathering hosted by the board, he noticed a catering employee wearing a badge in the wrong color for that particular event, a detail so small that most people would never have registered it at all. He quietly alerted building security, and within minutes an attempted data breach was stopped before it could begin. without a single raised voice or a moment of visible chaos. Vivienne still assumed he had simply gotten lucky. On the ride home, unable to help herself, she asked whether he had ever served in the military, expecting him to either deny it or embellish it the way so many men did when trying to seem more interesting than they were. Instead, he told her only that he had once held a job built around bringing people home safely, nothing more, and when she pressed him about the empty spaces in his file, he answered in a voice that closed the conversation as gently and firmly as a door. "Some work," he said, "is done best when nobody ever learns who did it." Later that night, alone in his small apartment after his daughter had already gone to sleep at her grandmother's house across town, Callum received a message on a phone he rarely used anymore, 4 words glowing on the screen with a weight that made his hands go still. Harbor Glass is reopening. He sat with the phone in his hand for a long time, the small kitchen around him quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a television through the thin apartment wall. He thought of the ocean at night, of cold water and the particular silence that settled over a crew right before everything went wrong, memories he had spent years trying to fold neatly away where they could not reach him. On the counter sat a drawing Lena had made him the week before, a crayon rendering of their small kitchen with 3 stick figures standing in it, and he found himself staring at it longer than the message on his phone. Whatever Harbor Glass wanted from him now, he decided, it would not be allowed to touch the life he had built one careful day at a time since he had walked away from all of it. Vivienne was scheduled to travel to a naval base along the coast to present Sentinel Beacon to a room full of senior officials, a system engineered to locate soldiers and sailors in distress even when ordinary communications had completely failed. Success in that room meant a contract worth more than anything Ashcroft Maritime Technologies had ever secured. Failure meant the board might finally have the leverage it needed to wrestle control of the company away from her for good. Callum noticed, almost immediately, that the architecture behind Sentinel Beacon echoed a rescue protocol his old unit had once relied on during a mission the world was never meant to hear about, a detail that made the hair on his neck rise the moment he saw the schematics on her tablet. He warned Vivienne that their route to the base might already be compromised, but when she demanded to know how he could possibly be certain, he could not tell her the truth without unraveling secrets that were never his alone to give away. She decided, not unreasonably from where she stood, that her driver had overstepped the boundaries of his role and ordered him to follow the path her own security team had already approved days earlier. Callum agreed on the surface, though beneath it he quietly searched the vehicle again, this time uncovering a second tracking device, cleverly hidden inside the very navigation system her own company had installed. That single discovery told him something far more troubling than a stranger watching from a distance. Whoever was leaking their movements worked from somewhere inside Ashcroft Maritime itself. Callum dialed a number he had not used in years, and the voice that answered belonged to Rowan Pike, once his subordinate and now a lieutenant commander with a steadiness Callum remembered well. There was a brief pause on the line before Pike spoke again, the kind of pause that told Callum his old friend already understood exactly why the call was coming after so much silence between them. Pike confirmed that fragments of classified data connected to Harbor Glass had surfaced inside the very software Vivienne was preparing to demonstrate to the Navy, a discovery that turned a business trip into something far more dangerous than either of them had first imagined. Pike asked whether Callum intended to step back into uniform even briefly to help contain the situation, and Callum answered honestly that he did not know yet, that he had built a life around staying out of rooms exactly like the one Pike was describing. Even so, he could not ignore what the leak meant for the handful of people who had trusted him with their lives on that ship years earlier, men and women who now had families and mortgages and quiet routines of their own to protect. Callum understood, with a cold certainty that settled into his stomach, that someone was not merely trying to sabotage a contract. Someone was hunting for the names of every person who had ever been part of that mission, including his own. As they drove toward the coast the next morning, Callum discovered that the officially approved route led directly toward a checkpoint that did not exist anywhere in the actual traffic control system, a phantom stop built into the plan by someone who understood exactly how to make a trap look like routine procedure. Midway through the drive, Vivienne received an urgent call from Gideon insisting she stick precisely to the planned route no matter what, a demand that only deepened the unease already coiling tight in Callum's chest. Moments later, a patrol vehicle appeared ahead, signaling for them to turn onto a side road, though Callum noticed instantly that the insignia painted on its door did not match the jurisdiction they were currently driving through. Rather than slow down, he cut sharply onto an old service road running along the coastline, a route so obscure that few maps still bothered to mark it at all. Vivienne, furious and frightened in equal measure, accused him of either kidnapping her outright or single-handedly wrecking the most important presentation of her career. Callum disabled the vehicle's communication system to prevent any outside interference, and asked her as calmly as he could manage to remove the smart bracelet issued by her own company, explaining that it might be broadcasting their exact position to whoever was watching. She refused at first, demanding he stop the car immediately and let her out into whatever danger she assumed could not possibly be as bad as sitting beside him. Reluctantly, he admitted that the vehicle behind them was not law enforcement at all, and that her navigation system had almost certainly been compromised from the inside. When the imposter patrol car continued pursuing them, Callum guided the vehicle through a narrow maintenance corridor near the docks, not with reckless speed but with the exact, practiced calm of a man who had done far more dangerous things than outrun a single tail on a coastal road. Vivienne, gripping the door handle in silence, began to notice for the first time that every single motion he made carried the weight of deliberate calculation rather than panic. The wind off the water rattled against the windows as the car cut through the narrow service road, salt heavy in the air even with the windows sealed shut, and for the first time since she had hired him, Vivienne felt genuinely afraid rather than simply annoyed. She watched Callum's hands on the wheel, steady and unhurried, despite the vehicle closing the distance behind them, and something in his calm unsettled her more than outright panic would have. He checked the mirror once more, adjusted his speed by only a fraction, and guided the car around a bend so smoothly that she barely felt the shift in her seat. Callum switched on an old radio frequency and spoke words that meant nothing to her, but clearly meant everything to whoever was listening on the other end. Lantern One requesting a silent harbor. When she asked who Lantern One was, he offered no answer at all, his eyes fixed on the road with an intensity she had never once seen on the face of any driver in her life. Then, without warning, a wall of black vehicles rose up ahead, blocking the road completely, and for one terrifying moment Vivienne became convinced they had driven straight into something far larger and far more dangerous than the ambush she had already imagined. The SUVs formed a tight ring around her car, and men in tactical gear stepped out with the kind of discipline that told Vivienne, even in her panic, that these were not amateurs playing dress-up on some quiet coastal road. She braced herself for the worst while Callum simply cut the engine and rested both hands calmly on the wheel, as though he had rehearsed this exact moment 1,000 times before it ever happened. The door of the lead vehicle opened, and Rowan Pike walked forward, looked through the windshield at the man in the driver's seat, and snapped instantly to attention. The entire team behind him raised their hands in salute at the same moment, a wall of silent respect that made the air in the car feel suddenly heavier than steel. "Commander Reed, the area is secure," Pike said, his voice carrying the crisp certainty of a man reporting to someone he had once followed, without hesitation, into places most people would never dare to go. Vivienne sat frozen, staring at the man she had mocked for wearing a tattoo he supposedly did not earn. He was not merely a veteran with an old symbol on his arm. He had once commanded every single person standing at attention in front of her car, and the realization landed with a force that made her chest tighten with something close to shame. She thought back to the way she had spoken to him in the front seat that very first day, the careless certainty in her own voice as she accused him of buying a symbol he had not earned. Watching grown men who had clearly faced real danger stand rigid with respect for him now, she understood how completely she had misjudged the quiet stranger who had been driving her to appointments all week. It occurred to her uncomfortably that she had built an entire opinion of him out of nothing but a tattoo and a thin employment file, the same lazy shortcut she claimed to despise when other people used it against her. Everett Kane had spent 30 years in the Navy, most of them watching younger officers pass through his command with varying degrees of promise, but few had ever earned the kind of quiet devotion Callum inspired among the men who served beside him. His own son had been aboard that stricken vessel during Harbor Glass. One of the engineers Callum had refused to leave behind even when the mission plan called for a far safer, far more conservative choice. Kane had never forgotten the debt, and he had spent years afterward quietly making sure no harm ever came to the man who had walked away from the Navy without asking for a single thing in return. Admiral Everett Kane stepped out of the final vehicle in the convoy and walked toward Callum with the deliberate weight of a man who had waited years for this particular reunion. He performed the formal salute himself before speaking, his voice carrying the gravity of decades in uniform. Kane explained that Callum's signal had triggered an emergency protocol that had not been used since the operation known only as Harbor Glass, a name that made Vivienne's stomach drop even though she still did not understand what it meant. The SEAL team had not surrounded her vehicle to detain anyone at all. They had formed a shield because inside that car sat both Vivienne and a device carrying compromised defense data that someone clearly wanted very badly. Vivienne finally found her voice and asked why a man once respected enough to earn a full military salute would choose to spend his days driving a stranger through city traffic. Callum answered simply that the work had once meant bringing someone home safely, and that he had never considered such work beneath him, not for a single day of his life. The words settled over Vivienne like cold water, forcing her to remember every small, careless insult she had thrown at him over the past week without a second thought. Kane asked whether Callum would temporarily take charge of coordinating her protection, since whoever had orchestrated the leak clearly understood naval protocol far too well for comfort. Callum refused to rejoin the service on any permanent basis, but he agreed, without hesitation, to see Vivienne safely through the presentation that had brought them to this road in the first place. Before they could return to the vehicles, Kane delivered one more piece of information that darkened Callum's expression for the first time all morning. The stolen data carried a digital signature matching Callum's own old access codes, which meant that whoever had engineered this entire situation intended, from the very beginning, to make him the first person anyone suspected. Back at the base, Vivienne finally learned the truth behind the name that had been echoing through the last several days like a warning bell. Harbor Glass had been a covert rescue operation years earlier sent to extract a group of engineers and service members from a vessel crippled after its communication systems failed completely in open water. Callum had broken from the approved plan in order to save every single person trapped aboard that ship a decision that succeeded brilliantly but exposed fragments of classified communication technology in the process. To protect the identities of the survivors and avoid a public inquiry that could have compromised far more than a single mission, Callum had quietly taken full responsibility onto himself. He left the service before the classified report, confirming that his choice had saved dozens of lives ever reached the desks that mattered, walking away from honors he never wanted and a spotlight he had spent years avoiding ever since. The tattoo on his arm was never meant as a boast. It was the only thing he had allowed himself to keep from that entire chapter of his life. Kane described, in careful and measured words, how the young engineers pulled from that stricken vessel had gone on to build ordinary lives. One of them now teaching high school science on the opposite coast, another running a small hardware store with 2 children of his own. None of them knew the full extent of what Callum had sacrificed to keep their names out of every report that followed, and none of them had ever been given the chance to thank him properly for it. Vivienne listened in silence, beginning to understand that the quiet, unremarkable man who drove her car every day carried a weight far heavier than any title she had ever held at Ashcroft Maritime. It struck her, sitting there in the sterile briefing room, that real strength rarely announced itself the way she had always assumed it would. She thought of her father, who had once told her that the measure of a man was rarely visible on the surface, and how easily she had forgotten that lesson the moment a stranger's file arrived thinner than she thought it should be. Standing in the hallway of the base with the smell of salt air still clinging to her clothes, Vivienne felt something shift inside her that no boardroom victory had ever managed to touch. Vivienne offered a sincere apology for every dismissive word she had thrown his way, and Callum accepted it without turning the moment into something larger than it needed to be, careful not to let her guilt curdle into pity he had no use for. He reminded her, gently but firmly, that his past did not make him more valuable than any driver, security guard, or laborer she might otherwise have overlooked without a second thought. Kane explained that whoever had stolen the data had pulled Callum's old access codes directly from a sealed archive and planted them inside Sentinel Beacon itself, positioning him to take the blame the moment the system failed in front of the Navy. Vivienne realized, with a chill spreading through her, that only a small handful of senior leaders at Ashcroft Maritime possessed the kind of access required to pull off something so precise and so deliberately cruel. Gideon Wexler's name sat near the very top of that short and troubling list. Before she could gather her thoughts further, her phone rang with Gideon's voice on the other end, informing her in clipped, formal tones that the board had just voted to suspend her as chief executive for vanishing without explanation alongside a driver of questionable background. Gideon moved quickly to control the narrative inside the company, spinning her absence into a full-blown leadership crisis within hours of the vote. He told employees and select reporters that Vivienne had abandoned the most important presentation of her career and allowed an unknown man dangerously close to classified technology without proper vetting. The company's stock dropped sharply as the story spread, and the board scheduled an emergency session to consider selling Ashcroft Maritime outright to a rival conglomerate quietly known as the Wexler Consortium. Inside the building, longtime employees who had worked under Vivienne for years began to whisper among themselves, unsure whether to trust the woman who had built the place or the polished operations director who suddenly seemed to have every answer ready in advance. Gideon played the part of the loyal steward beautifully, expressing calm concern for the company's future while carefully steering every conversation toward the idea that new leadership might finally bring stability. Maris watched it all unfold with growing unease, noticing how easily Gideon slipped into meetings that had nothing to do with his usual responsibilities, always ready with documents that seemed prepared just a little too quickly to be spontaneous. She said nothing publicly, choosing instead to quietly gather her own observations, certain that something about his sudden confidence did not add up to genuine concern for the company at all. Vivienne wanted to reveal Callum's true identity immediately, certain that proof of Navy protection would silence every accusation in a single stroke. Callum stopped her before she could act, warning that exposing his past would inevitably expose the names of everyone who had survived Harbor Glass alongside him. People who had rebuilt quiet lives, specifically because no one knew what they had been through. Instead of relying on his history as a shield, they needed hard evidence that Gideon himself had manipulated the data from the very beginning. Callum reviewed every incident of the past week with methodical patience and noticed that Gideon consistently reacted far too quickly to changes that only someone inside the car should have known about. The office grew quiet around midnight, most of the building empty except for the hum of the air conditioning and the soft glow of two monitors reflecting off the glass walls of Vivienne's office. Maris worked with the steady focus of someone who had learned long ago not to speak until she was certain, scrolling through months of login timestamps while Vivienne read over her shoulder, arms crossed against the growing chill of the room. Vivienne and Maris dug through internal access logs late into the night and discovered a hidden account registered under the name of Vivienne's own late father, a detail so calculated it made her hands tremble as she read it on the screen. Maris reached across the desk and squeezed her friend's hand once, a small gesture that said more than any words could have managed at that late hour. Gideon's plan slowly came into focus. He intended to sabotage the Sentinel beacon demonstration, cost the company its Navy contract, and then pressure the Ashcroft family into selling their shares for a fraction of their true value once panic set in. Still, they lacked direct proof tying him to the tracking devices and the falsified access codes planted so carefully in Callum's name. Callum proposed feeding a fabricated route alongside a fake version of the software into the system, forcing Gideon into a position where he would have no choice but to act and expose himself in the process. Vivienne asked whether he was certain the plan would work, and Callum answered honestly that he was not, though he added quietly that people who were used to controlling everything rarely tolerated being left in the dark for very long. Fewer than 10 minutes after the false route had been sent, an outside team was already moving toward coordinates that corresponded to a location that did not exist anywhere in the real world. Callum, Vivienne, and Pike's team quietly built a case designed to gather evidence without resorting to a single moment of open confrontation or violence. They constructed a decoy version of Sentinel beacon embedded with digital tracking code, granting access to only one person inside the entire company, Gideon Wexler. The waiting stretched through the afternoon in near silence, Vivienne pacing the length of her office, while Callum sat calmly by the window, watching the street below with the same patience he had once used to wait out storms at sea. Maris kept refreshing the server logs every few minutes, her coffee growing cold beside her keyboard, until finally a small alert blinked on her screen that made her breath catch in her throat. Within hours, the decoy file appeared on servers belonging to a rival defense contractor, confirming everything they had suspected but had not yet been able to prove beyond doubt. Realizing he was being watched, Gideon attempted to erase the company's system logs remotely, but Vivienne used her founding authority to lock him out of the network before he could finish. In a final act of desperation, Gideon triggered a hidden program capable of destroying the original Sentinel beacon data entirely, a program Callum recognized instantly as something built on the bones of an old Harbor Glass protocol. While engineers around him scrambled in growing panic, Callum calmly recited a shutdown sequence he still remembered from memory, stopping the destruction of the data with only seconds left before it would have been lost for good. Vivienne understood then that Gideon could not have built something so sophisticated entirely on his own, which meant a former defense contractor connected to Callum's earlier investigation had almost certainly helped him along the way. Pike's team traced the outside communication and quietly handed the evidence over to federal investigators before the day was finished. Even so, Gideon walked into the board meeting the following morning with his usual composed confidence, insisting that no one could ever truly prove the hidden account belonged to him at all. The board meeting became the final confrontation between Vivienne and the man who had spent months quietly working to destroy everything she had built. Gideon presented a polished report accusing her of reckless leadership, unexplained schedule changes, and hiring a driver whose military past raised more questions than answers. He produced old records suggesting Callum had once been investigated in the aftermath of Harbor Glass, hoping the implication alone would be enough to poison the room against them both. Callum neither defended himself nor revealed anything classified in order to clear his own name, standing quietly at the back of the room with the same patience he had carried through every difficult moment of the past week. Vivienne rose to her feet and admitted, without flinching, that she had judged Callum by his appearance and his job title rather than the man standing in front of her. She told the board plainly that this very arrogance had almost blinded her to the danger growing inside her own company, hidden behind a familiar and trusted face. She laid out the access logs, the decoy file, and the tracking data that all led directly back to devices under Gideon's control, watching his composure begin to crack for the first time since the meeting had started. The board members who had seemed so eager only minutes earlier to entertain his version of events now sat in uncomfortable silence, exchanging glances that made it clear the tide in the room had already begun to turn. Conrad Ashcroft, seated at the head of the table, folded his hands and studied his niece with an expression that mixed pride with quiet regret for ever having doubted her judgment. Gideon insisted, weakly, that the evidence could easily have been fabricated by Callum himself, grasping for any argument that might still save him. The doors opened and Admiral Everett Kane walked in beside a federal investigator, their presence silencing the room instantly. Kane revealed nothing about the classified details of Harbor Glass, offering only his personal confirmation that Callum had once held senior command and had never, in any sense, betrayed the country he served. Kane turned toward Callum, stood at full attention, and saluted him in front of every board member who had spent the past week treating him as nothing more than an anonymous driver. One by one, the same executives who had barely acknowledged his presence rose respectfully to their feet. As two federal agents guided him toward the door, Gideon glanced once at Vivienne, his expression no longer the polished mask he had worn for years, but something closer to quiet, bitter resignation. He said nothing further, understanding that any last argument would only make the moment more humiliating than it already was. Gideon was escorted out quietly for questioning, without a single raised voice or moment of physical struggle disturbing the room. The board reversed its earlier vote, canceled all discussion of selling the company, and formally restored Vivienne to her position as chief executive. Conrad Ashcroft rose from his seat, crossed the room, and embraced his niece for the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember, murmuring an apology of his own for ever entertaining Gideon's version of events. The rest of the board offered quiet nods and murmured congratulations, though Vivienne found she cared far less about their approval now than she once might have. What mattered more, standing there in the aftermath, was the steady presence of the man who had spent the past week proving, again and again, that character rarely announced itself with noise. Afterward, Vivienne offered Callum a senior executive position on the spot, hoping to reward him properly for everything he had risked. He declined, explaining quietly that he had no interest in being handed authority simply because his past had finally been revealed to a room full of strangers. 3 months later, Sentinel Beacon passed a new round of testing and received formal approval from the Navy, securing the very contract that had once nearly cost Vivienne everything she had built. She restructured the company from the ground up, establishing an independent division dedicated to ethics oversight and data protection, determined to ensure that no one inside Ashcroft Maritime could ever again hide behind a trusted title the way Gideon once had. She never pushed Callum to become a public symbol of the crisis they had survived together, understanding by then that he had earned the right to choose his own visibility. Instead, she offered him the role of Director of Safety Strategy on the condition that he could keep a flexible schedule to care for his family and would never be required to stand in front of a camera or a reporter. Callum accepted, not because the title impressed him, but because the work itself felt meaningful in a way that had nothing to do with medals or applause. On his very first morning in the new role, Vivienne found him outside in the parking lot, quietly checking the old company car before any trip, exactly as he always had. She asked, half amused, why a director would still be doing a driver's work with his own 2 hands. Callum answered simply that a new title did not change his responsibility to bring people home safely, and that some habits were not meant to be left behind just because circumstances had changed. In the final quiet scene, Vivienne shared a short, unhurried meal with Callum's daughter, Lena, nothing rushed and nothing overstated, only the gentle sense that Callum was slowly allowing someone new into the careful, quiet life he had built for the 2 of them. Lena talked easily about her school and a drawing she had started of a boat on the water, and Vivienne found herself listening with a kind of attention she rarely gave to anything outside a boardroom. Callum watched the 2 of them from across the small table, saying little, content simply to see the careful walls around his daughter's world open just a crack wider than before. Before she stepped out of the car that evening, she noticed the trident tattoo on his arm once more, though this time she did not ask about missions or medals or anything he had left behind. She only said that perhaps she had spent far too long failing to see the man who had been sitting in front of her the entire time. Callum pulled his sleeve down, opened the door for her with the same quiet courtesy he had shown from the very first day, and offered a small, easy smile before speaking. At least this time, he said, she had finally chosen the right person to drive her forward. The car pulled away from Ashcroft headquarters just as the sun began to rise over the harbor, closing the story of a man who had once commanded the most elite warriors in the country and had, in the end, simply chosen the quiet road he wanted to walk for himself.